I think there's some very fundamental lessons to be learned. And I think they begin with the whole interactive nature of the kind of crisis we will have to deal with in the future. If you take a look at the tragedy in Japan, this was a tragedy that brought together an earthquake, a tsunami, and a major nuclear crash that in turn led to destruction of the infrastructure, road systems, etc. There are no single events that do not trigger other events, and this is the critical factor that comes out of the Japanese crisis.
And in terms of the recovery, we heard there about the various initiatives. It's very early days, of course, in Japan. This isn't a crisis. A crisis in many ways is still going on.
Very much.
But are there things that the government should be doing at this stage?
Well, I think that the sorts of things that the government is doing already is, I think, about as good as one can do in the tremendously confusing situation that one has to face. But I think what is really important is the government's admission, and the Prime Minister Naoto Kan in particular, who accepted that there really had not been sufficiently adequate planning to deal with this kind of crisis. I think this is a very important and a very positive admission on his part.
And a very surprising one, because what everyone's been emphasising is that if this kind of disaster happened, in a way, perhaps the best place for it to happen would be in Japan because of the amount of planning that they do have in place.
And I think that is such a very important point, because basically you have probably one of the best prepared countries in the world, and still there were gaps. And what we should take from this is not accusation and not finger pointing at the Japanese, but rather to say there's a huge lesson to be learned, and that is what we have to do is to think more systematically, look into more interactive scenarios, do different kind of planning so that the kinds of lessons, and I emphasize lessons, not criticisms, the kind of lessons we can learn from Japan will be applied in crises in the future.
Okay, well, let's look at lessons then in practical terms. Now, we talked in a way about generalities, but right around the Indian Ocean coast, people have been involved in lots of initiatives trying to get back together. There's housing, of course, trying to get people back to earn money, jobs, this kind of thing. Is this what the Japanese should be looking at?
No, I think the Japanese will already have been looking at the ways that they will deal with 250,000 displaced people to try and put them into houses, temporary or hopefully permanent. I think the Japanese government has already restored the electricity system, which will then start generating the nuclear reactors. But I think the real point that comes out of this is, will the Japanese government in the future begin to start thinking more laterally about the interconnectedness of various types of crisis drivers? But I think even more importantly, will the international community take up that lesson and begin to understand that there is no single crisis, and that planning for the kinds of crises that we will see in the future requires far more interconnected approaches than we've seen today, including in that highly sophisticated country, Japan.
Interconnected in what sense? You mean making sure that various parts of the organisation, of the government, of the administration work together, working with other countries? I mean, what are we talking about here?
Well, I think that's a very, very good point. And if I may just take a look at the example here in the United Kingdom, that it was only recently that the Parliamentary Select Committee on Science and Technology accused the government of failing to try and use science effectively in its own emergency management. So this is one very good example that I think should go around the world, and that is we have resources, we have capacities, we have to use them more effectively.